Good morning and good afternoon for all the friends that follow from different parts of the world. My name is Carmelo Ferlito and I'm the CEO of the Center for Market Education, a think tank based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I'm here today to talk with Father Robert Sirico, founder and president of the Acton Institute in Michigan, United States. I don't think that Father Sirico needs my presentation, but for the few of us that don't know him and the Acton Institute, I would like to ask Father Sirico to introduce himself and the activity of the Acton Institute.
Well, thank you very much, Carmelo, for the introduction and for the honor of being with you all today. I should also say that the Acton Institute has an office in Rome. For those of you who are viewing from Italy, we'd be very happy to host you there if you want to come to our office in the Via Vittorio Emanuele. So you're most welcome. I founded the Acton Institute about 30 years ago with a colleague, a layman, who I had met when he was studying economics, international economics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I was studying theology about an hour away at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And we became acquainted, and I introduced him. Here's an economics student, but I introduced him to the writings of Friedrich Bastiat and Hayek and Mises and other free market thinkers that he had never really come across. And he was a young man. I thought perhaps he had a vocation in the priesthood, but it turned out that he didn't. And he's been the executive director of the Institute now for 30 years. He met his girlfriend, or now his wife, when he was making deposits for the Acton Institute very early in our history. I founded the Institute because I was concerned that many of our, if I speak in a Catholic context, but this applies as well to evangelicals, to Jewish people, to Muslims as well, that many religious leaders just don't have a deep grasp of economics. They very often, and should, have a great love for the poor, but they don't think of that in economic terms. They tend to think of it in sentimental terms, in relational terms. We'll have an opportunity to speak about these tensions, but let's remember that in addition to the fact that there's a great deal of sentiment and emotion in ministering to the poor and vulnerable, there's also an economic dimension to it. If you speak about poverty, you're already speaking about economy. And so to understand how an economy functions, it seems to me was a very important part of our ministry. And so we founded the Institute especially to help inoculate people against the thinking of the socialist ideas, which is primarily a model of redistributing wealth rather than creating wealth. Again, that we can talk about in more detail. So that's the founding of the Acton Institute, and it's available to everyone all over the world, acton.org online. Many books and articles and conferences and videos and things like that.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I think indeed that the reality of the Acton Institute is pretty unique. One of the few realities that is both Catholic inspired and oriented to the promotion of a sound vision of economics, something that makes Acton mission very close to Center for Market Education mission, which is in fact trying to promote a better understanding of economics and what, in fact, we can discuss the same in relation with poverty. What do we mean by unintended consequences? Something that economists like Friedrich Hayek always stress the importance of unintended consequences. One thing is the desire to help the poor. One thing is to implement a policy that, although being driven by the desire of helping the poor, can turn to harm the poor.
Exactly. Isn't it? It's amazing how our good intentions can, well, somebody once said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this is particularly the case. I think many of the people who have advocated various kinds of socialist policies that have failed, we've seen it over and over and over again for more than 100 years. I don't think most of those people had bad intentions. I don't think most of those people wanted to hurt people. They just didn't understand how a market functions.
In fact, and I often quote a simple example that I witnessed myself when a few years ago, the Malaysian government raised the minimum wage with the intention to help the poor and in particular immigrant workers. And I always tell to friends or policymakers, listen, I observed that when you did this, the shopping mall in front of my house, rather than increasing the salaries of the guys that were collecting the fee of the parking, replaced them with machines. So yes, you turn them to be unemployed.
It's more efficient. I mean, once the wage of a person goes higher than the market wage of it, it ends up happening. And what is also very lamentable about it is the fact that it's the most vulnerable workers. It's the newest, it's the youngest, and it's the most vulnerable. Those who have the least experience, who need an entry to the market to begin tutoring them in terms of what it means to be involved in the market, that these marginal people are the ones cut off. It's those who have more secure footing, who have more negotiating power, more longevity, greater talent, who are more secure and less affected by things like minimum wage laws. But everyone can be affected by a minimum wage law. It just depends on what the minimum wage is set at, right? I mean, if we're going to raise, now we're speaking in an international context, so it's difficult to use monetary units, but let's say you say the minimum wage in the United States has gone up to about $13 or $15 in some places. Well, if that's going to make those people wealthy, why not put it at $100 an hour?
Indeed.
Imagine what happens if you put it at $100 an hour, and then you get an idea of what happens on a micro level when you, anytime you put it above the market demand.
Indeed. Now, we are recording this interview for the Festival della Dottrina Sociale della Chiesa, the Christian Social Doctrine Festival that is held yearly in Verona. It's my hometown and organized by some people that are very dear to me. So I'm happy to record this interview for them and for the public. Now,
forse la prossima volta posso essere con voi a Verona, invece di qui a Grand Rapids.
Spero che ci potrò andare anch'io prima o poi quando il governo
i confini. È vero.
Then, so coming to discuss Catholic social action. Usually, when we discuss Catholic social action, we have in mind the rich association environment that emerged in the Catholic world, and it is oriented, to different emergencies. It can be medical, social, assistance, financial help, education. This is the rich world of Catholic social action. But then, if we look at these initiatives, often they can be defined as redistributive initiatives, okay? So the wealth that is somehow being created needs to be redistributed, and some attention needs to be paid for the most vulnerable part of the population. Now, it seems to me that indeed, before being redistributed, wealth, including cultural wealth, need to be created. And is it true, according to you, that in the Catholic environment, it is lacking a reflection on the Catholic as wealth creator? And if it is so, how is it possible that this vacuum emerged in the Catholic reflection?
Well, very good set of ideas that you put forth. And I certainly think it is the case, especially with the modern social teaching of the church, roughly following Rerum Novarum in 1890, that many of the popes have opted for a distributist. In fact, there's a whole movement called the distributism, and even more left-wing, a kind of Christian socialism at times. You see emerge in various reflections. But I think that the topic is complex because certainly in the history of the church, you have a certain respect for the monetary system, for the market process. A lot of these writers, especially in the school of Salamanca, the Spanish writers there, of various orders, Dominicans and Jesuits and even Franciscans reflecting on these things, really become the precursors to modern economics. Joseph Schumpeter, who is an economist, wrote that the schoolmen, or these are the disciples of St. Thomas Aquinas, were really the inventors of scientific economics in their own day, because they started out as theologians. So they think, what is our obligation morally in terms of charity toward other people, our sexual relations, and these other things. But eventually they came to the point of, what is my moral obligation in terms of what I have to pay someone? What's the moral obligation in terms of the price of a good or a service? Of something like inflation, because inflation existed, and they were able to identify it. All these were reflections of moral theologians, not economists. The discipline of economics comes later in history. So really, theology invents economics in one sense. That's why Adam Smith wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And I think, so all of that is to say that there's a conflict in Catholicism between her history and the memory of that history and the modern era. And I think probably more than any other cause for the lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation of market economy and Catholic thought, is that modern Catholic social teaching emerges in an agrarian moment with certain assumptions about how markets function, with a model more of a family than of an enterprise, because globalized markets were only coming to the fore in the 1800s. And I think that cast a certain frame of reference on Catholic social teaching. That, as well as the comfortable relationship that many religious leaders, bishops, hierarchy, even the Pope, the comfortable relationship prior to the French Revolution that the church had with aristocrats and government leaders. So it was disposed toward the notion that the church could really influence society by influencing the state. So I think these two kind of casts of mind we've not done away with. Historically, the encyclical of St. John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, begins to move us out of this frame of reference.
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched the two topics that are very dear to me. You introduced Schumpeter, on which I worked for my master thesis, and I had the luck to work with one of his students, one of his Harvard students. So yeah, I would say that Schumpeter burned my youth, and I spent most of my university years reading Schumpeter. Probably I read whatever he wrote and whatever was written about him and on him. So it really burned my youth. But
I would love to speak with you about it sometime. That's fascinating. I'm interested in the kind of religion he developed later in life, but we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, there is also a paper in which he advocated the importance of Quadragesimo Anno and Catholic corporatism. I think he published it in 1945. That paper, but that would bring our discussion too far away.
Sure,
But
sure.
I would like also to mention, you mentioned the Franciscan friars, and during my PhD, I indeed work on the history of the Monte di Pietà, the Franciscan pawn shops developed at the end of the Middle Age. So I did my dissertation on the technical mechanism of the Monte di Pietà during the 18th century, when they developed as a true bank.
Fascinating.
So I have spent quite some time working on these things that are indeed very much fascinating. And it is true that the economists of the School of Salamanca even anticipated the marginal revolution in identifying the source of value in subjective preferences. So they were more modern than Adam Smith somehow.
Yeah.
If you look back at the history of economic thought. But let's go back to the topic of our discussion. Yeah, please.
But yes, and maybe this is the bridge to that. It's interesting that everything you've cited, and as you say, we could go on and on and on about this, is not known today among Catholic social doctrine thinkers. You very rarely see it, a way of thinking about economy. So you have the stereotype that it's the Protestant work ethic rather than the spirit of democratic capitalism, as Michael Novak called it.
Actually, I'm quite lucky because I studied in the University of Verona, and the Department of Economic History where I studied and where my main teachers were used to teach was founded by an economic historian, a Catholic economic historian, Gino Barbieri, that was a disciple of Amintore Fanfani, who was a politician, but who also wrote a very important rebuke of Max Weber, Protestant Ethics, and the Spirit of Capitalism, before Michael Novak.
Right. Michael Novak pays him homage in his book.
To Fanfani. Yes. So we were all somehow obliged to know this piece of history. And in my alma mater, when I was president of the Antonio Rosmini Association, we had a chance to host Michael Novak precisely to discuss the Catholic ethic and the spirit of capitalism. We did an event, I think was in 2002. So I was much younger than now, half the age I am now. So,
and there you go. You mentioned Rosmini and Manzoni, these other thinkers. You know, Manzoni has this wonderful discussion of price controls in the I Promessi Sposi that I wrote an essay on it and sent it to the Pope because he likes Manzoni. And so look at this. Look at what he says, that the notion that you could set prices without regard to the reality is like a woman of a certain age who thinks she can make herself younger by changing the date on her birth certificate. That line from Manzoni?
That's nice. That's wonderful. So coming back to the core of our discussion, can we really discuss the Catholic as a category and the Catholic as a wealth creator? So every day, Catholics are involved in the daily life through jobs and also through responsibility positions. Think about the role of Catholics in the Italian politics up to 3 decades ago. So what is the added value that a Catholic can bring into the realm of the daily action and in the work environment, in politics, and indeed in what it is the realm of human action?
I think it's the anthropology of it. I think it's who human beings are and what our relationship is to the material world. I mean, Catholics in a particular sense have a deep reverence and are animated by the notion of the incarnation. The incarnation on one level sounds like a very abstract theological concept, but the whole existential reality of the incarnation is that God breaks out of the material world. Not that the material world is bad, but that is good, and that in order to be redeemed, it has to be brought back to a knowledge of itself. I think the thing that Catholics can bring to an understanding of work and entrepreneurship is that work has a telos. It's not just a utilitarian function. And that inspires not only the way in which you make money, but the way in which you treat the people who are helping you to make the money and the people who are consuming your goods and services. I'm reminded of an observation that one of the Council Fathers makes, in which he says that what we seek is not to Christianize our workplace, that is to put decorations up and make it look Christian, but to Christofinalize it, that is to more radically understand the enterprise itself as a vocation. I think you have the wonderful insights of Jose Maria Escrivá, the founder of Opus Dei, who speaks about the sanctification of the world through work. The things that we touch are in effect sacramental. The notion of work is seen, it pervades our understanding of the sacraments. Think of this, and this I learned from a priest from Modena, who has since died, but he once said this, and it stuck with me, that in introducing the most intimate communion with God, that is the Holy Eucharist, that Jesus chooses bread and wine and not grapes and grain. And what is the difference between bread and wine and grapes and grain? It is the work of human hands. Lavoro dell'uomo, as we say in the Mass when we're making this offering. So what we make, God takes and gives us something we could never make. And it's this transcendence, this understanding of transcendence in our vocation. And I could go on and point out how that's the reality in matrimony, in having children, the openness to new life, procreativity. It's two material beings coming together and through the inspiration of love, transcending themselves in having children. So all of these notions brought to an enterprise can inspire a person heroically, which is really what's required of the entrepreneur. So it's a deep, even I would say, dare say, mystical heroism, if you can see your business in that way.
Yes, that's very interesting. And of course, we already touched Schumpeter, who is another author that discusses entrepreneurship at large. And I've wrote about him, and I tried to reconcile him with Kirchner somehow. So yes. I did this crazy attempt. But so remaining on Catholic entrepreneurship, do you think, because we have the idea that the Catholic entrepreneur is an entrepreneur as anybody else, but at the end of the year he gives some money to the church or gives them some money to some good charity activity, and that's the distinguished feature of the Catholic entrepreneur. But you instead introduce something like a mystical vision of entrepreneurship instead. Yes. So like cooperating, can become a Eucharistic offer.
Exactly.
The work of human hands becomes a Eucharistic offer. This, I think, introduce a completely new sphere to our conception of Catholic entrepreneurship, also in terms of consequences, because if we think that when we work, we are basically participating into the Eucharistic sacrifice, I think the consequences are enormous. How do you see this? How do you see this as a defining trait of Catholic entrepreneurship as distinguished by normal entrepreneurship?
Well, I think it's like everything else, right? To quote the Second Vatican Council, the anthropology is Christology, and Christology is anthropology. The study of man is the study of Christ, and the study of Christ is the study of man. And this doesn't stop at the door of a shop or a factory. This continues there. And I think to go back to the quote earlier about Christianizing and Christo-finalizing, it's seeing the work as part of the vocation. It really is, I would say, the undiscovered truth of the Second Vatican Council. We've heard a lot of people after the Second Vatican Council speak about the role of the laity. What that has generally meant in most people's minds, now I lived in this period, in the post-conciliar period, what it meant to most people is we're going to dress laymen up like little priests, let them wear an alb, let them give out communion, let them read, and take these roles on like your little priests, as though this is the role of the laity. Well, that's absurd. That's not what the documents are about at all. I'm not saying there isn't a role for lay ministers in extraordinary circumstances of Holy Communion, but the normative role of the layperson is to be in the world, to be leaven in the world. It's to show the world the truth that is already embedded in the world. And if we can bring that truth, it's not just the utilitarian function of running a business like everyone else runs a business and having some extra money and then benefiting somebody else. Of course, charity is part of it. Of course, people fall in gaps and there are things where you need to add charity. But charity isn't the normative way in which the poor rise out of poverty. Business is the normative way in which that happens. And what a shame if we have businesses that don't bring that greater anthropological, that's why I started by saying it's a different anthropology, that deeper anthropological perspective, because the Protestant writer C.S. Lewis has a beautiful statement that I think reflects what I'm trying to say. He said, "You have never met a mere mortal. Everyone with whom you have ever come in contact, from the shop girl to your child, is either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor. But you've never met a mere mortal." And then he said, the most precious thing, the most sacred thing that presents itself to our senses is our neighbor. If you come at work with that perspective, it transforms the meaning of what you're doing. Everybody talks about, especially the Marxists, talk about work in capitalist society as alienating. This is the antithesis of alienation.
That's interesting. And if you allow me to deviate a little bit on the conversation, because we live in a world that fill our heart with expectations that are often frustrated. I mean, not everybody comes up with a career that is the career that he or she wanted. I wanted to become a university professor, and I ended up working in agriculture in Malaysia, by the way. I mean, now I'm happy, but I went through quite an internal struggle when I was forced to abandon the academic career. And it took me 10 years to come at terms with that frustration, okay? And if you allow the personal confession here, it took me a cancer to go through it, and a cancer relapse, actually. Because at a certain point when I relapsed in my cancer, things were falling apart. So I was having a wonderful career, a career that anyhow was giving me money, but I didn't really like. I was frustrated because I couldn't achieve what I wanted professionally. At a certain point, I found myself with a cancer relapse, a failed operation, my company putting me on a part-time basis, far away from home. So it was like if everything was falling apart. And then all of a sudden I was under chemotherapy, and on the 16th July 2018, so 16th July is the day of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, where,
Yes.
where my name comes from.
Carmelo.
Carmelo, yeah. And I was in the only Carmelite monastery in Malaysia for a mass. I remember it's around 80 kilometers from my home. My father was here, and a colleague of mine was here too. And somehow something happened during that celebration, and something that gave me an enormous sense of peace and well-being. And it was like Jesus speaking to me and said, this is what is going on in your life. Accept it, and it will generate if you embrace this reality. Okay, so it changed the way in which I approached the work that I never liked and that I did for more than 10 years. You know, you imagine working for 10 years doing something you hate doing for the sake of making a living. But I started to look at my job that remained the same. It remained the job that I didn't like. It didn't change. You know? To look at my colleagues and my environment with different eyes, with all my limitations, but somehow with the eyes of Jesus loving me. So I start to love the reality surrounding me. And that was something like an epiphany. And the world around me was completely transformed. The way in which I was working, my expectations. I mean, not much changed in a practical way, but it changed substantially. And this made a difference, I think, also in my office. And my office grew, and my office became a reference point for our different branches around the world. But because I started to put the heart, because I recognized the grace that was filling me in doing what I was doing, so my work environment flourished also from a practical perspective. So I
and I could imagine that your health would improve, because an environment like that increases the ability of the immune system, who has a more positive outlook on their condition, has a greater chance of survival. This was the book of people who survived the Holocaust.
Yeah, and I would like to ask you, I mean, your comment on this apparent dichotomy between accepting somehow the circumstances that also professionally, and so making flourish whatever circumstance comes to you because it comes from God, and the strive for better situation, for doing something that is probably more consistent with your expectations, with what you had in mind. How should we position ourselves in this struggle? Should we accept everything, or should we find a balance between these two tensions in something like our entrepreneurial soul, so to say?
Yeah, I guess I'm not seeing it as, putting things on a scale. I guess that's one way in which you could look at it, but I'm seeing it more holistically and saying, what's the meaning of what I do? If I have the right meaning, the right understanding of it, it gives everything that I do, everything that I produce, everyone with whom I deal and collaborate, a different meaning, a different culture, a different sensibility. So it's not so much a challenge of how do I hold this tension? I mean, there is a tension in it, obviously, but how do I understand what it is that I'm doing? It is the human condition that what we desire will never be satiated, right? We will continue to desire. It's both the root of the consumerist culture, that we want more, we want to consume more, so we keep consuming, and we find find that we are human doings rather than human beings. We allow the culture to become the God and the be-all, the consumerism to become the God and the be-all and end-all of our lives. But if we approach this with a holistic attitude to see that there's a telos beyond our prosperity, there's a telos beyond our liberty, there's a purpose to our existence, then we touch things in the world differently. We don't worship them, we use them as tools. And sometimes it's tools to be more creative, and other times it's tools to be more generous, or both at the same time. Maimonides once, Maimonides, the great rabbi, medieval rabbi, had this ladder of virtue. And he goes up the ladder, and the two highest points of the ladder are in helping others. A high point of charity is when you give something to someone and they don't know that you gave it to them. And then the highest point of charity is when you render someone into a circumstance whereby they no longer need your charity. That's what enterprise does. So that people can take care of themselves. And this, again, goes back to meaning.
That's great. So coming back to the Catholic social doctrine, could you help us to find those passages in the texts or in the encyclicas where we really can find some reference to entrepreneurship? Is there, or we need to dig a bit in depth?
Well, I think the charter of Catholic entrepreneurship is found first in Centesimus Annus. St. John Paul II, in looking at the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Empire, speaks about the anthropological mistake of socialism and the potential for a market economy. I say potential because what Catholic social teaching can never accept is that human beings are treated as instruments for other people's success. So if that's what people mean by capitalism, if it means the notion that the market can supply all human needs, then this, from the Catholic point of view, is heretical. But if we have a notion of enterprise, a business economy, that is rooted in an ethical understanding of who human beings are, grounded in private property, which is sacred, then we have a different form of capitalism that can emerge, or free economy. I prefer the term free economy to capitalism because capitalism is too narrow an understanding, too mechanistic, in fact. So I think I would start with Centesimus Annus. There's a wonderful, I don't remember the date of it, but I remember there's a wonderful letter from Pius XII to a group of business people, which is a kind of preliminary to Centesimus Annus. By the way, there's one passage in Centesimus Annus that I think is really, if you will, a kind of hermeneutic of how to walk through these things. It says that entrepreneurship throws practical light back on to Christian virtue. It shows how it can be done in three dimensions rather than just theologically expressed as a sentiment. And I think that's beautiful. I think also the Compendium of Catholic, the Compendium of Catholic Social Doctrine, I think is the name of it, is very good in terms of compiling a lot of these notions about work, about enterprise, profit, and like. Then finally, I would say that in addition to the Compendium on Catholic Social Teaching, understanding the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity says that needs are best met at the most local level of their existence. Really, the principle has a prejudice against the state. It doesn't say the state can't do things, but it says the state's role is not normative, that it should be temporary, it should be limited in the depth of the intervention only when there's objective need, but that the normal way is for society's mediating institutions to begin functioning again. And I think when you think about the principle of subsidiarity, you see that the great bulk of social relations need to be voluntary and not mediated by the state.
That's very true, and it is interesting. There is a discussion about this even here in Malaysia, and hopefully can become part of the political conversation. So, partially related to this, I have actually a personal curiosity. I have the luck to work in the Far East for a European company, but I have worked for an American company. I've spent time in the United States. I visited quite a big part of the world. And I've noticed that if I look at the expressions of Catholic social actions in the United States and in Europe, in particular in Southern Europe, there is this sort of dichotomy that I've noticed. Activities, initiatives that are in Europe remain mostly confined to the associative dimension. Okay. Charity, even big initiative, but they remain, there is a lack of entrepreneurial spirit in there. While these things, if done in the United States, they assume, or in North America in general, they assume firm dimension, an entrepreneurial dimension, so they go on a bigger scale. So they outreach, the potential of their mission is much bigger. I think even at a recent discovery, for me, EWTN, the media channel from Canada, which I think was created by a nun, and now is a huge worldwide media.
No, in the United States, Alabama.
Okay, I was founded in Alabama.
Alabama in the United States. A handicapped nun.
Yes, and
she was a great businesswoman. But even, I don't know, I know Italians don't know Mother Frances Cabrini in the United States. She was a missionary from Italy who ministered largely at that time, the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, to Italian immigrants. There were a lot of Italian immigrants to the United States. And I wrote an essay on her once as Mother Cabrini as entrepreneur, because when you go through her historical record, the deals she negotiated were astounding. So there's all of that. You're quite correct in noting that even what we would call our nonprofits, that are charitable associations, the mediating institutions here in the United States, tend to be much more oriented on business models. There's evaluations of things, and it's not the same thing, because if I'm running a factory that produces tires, then I know if I'm producing the kind of tires that people want by the fact that they buy more of them. With ministry to the poor and the vulnerable, you can't use the same, you're not selling things, you're offering service. So you have to find a different model of how to evaluate your success. But the presumption is that we should be accomplishing what we set out to do, not just to kind of talk with one another. This annoys me. I'm an Italian American, a real Italian American. I'm a dual citizen, right? So I'm not just saying this. I know the Italian culture. And I always find it so frustrating. It's beautiful, but it's frustrating to sit around and have biscotti and espressi and talk about all these things rather than say, look, we've got 5 people we have to visit today and we have to achieve this, this, and this, and this. And I know from their perspective, they look at me and say, oh, you're such a cold American, tu fai americano, that kind of thing. So here's what I think the theological basis is, or the philosophical basis. And it comes from Etienne Gilson, who was a great French philosopher. He said, if you want to construct such a great act of piety, like a cathedral, that has a facade like that of Notre Dame, or I even think of San Marco, the spires represent the rising of the soul to God. Etienne Gilson said, if you want to achieve that, we must first understand geometry. He said, piety is powerless to make use of nature for the glory of God. Piety is never a substitute for technique. You have to respect technique. And these must go together, because piety, the sense of God, the sense of mystery, is what gives technique its meaning. But technique is how you get it done. It's that dimension of prudence, of the virtue of prudence, how we can accomplish this thing. And I think we have to hold them all together. We can't just be cold and say, okay, I just need to produce these many meals for hungry people. Because sometimes what hungry people need isn't just a meal, it's somebody to eat the meal with. And that's that kind of more European communal sense of it. I think these things need to go together.
That's very interesting. I mean, we are two poets, but
Right.
we need a little bit of entrepreneurial technique, not only spirit, but
right.
Really.
You know, if I would use a theological analogy about this, I would say it's the way in which the church resolved the problem of the Docetists and the Arians. Now, perhaps I'm too deep in theology here for our audience. So these are two Christological heresies very early in Christian history. And the Docetists said Jesus was so much God. They affirmed the deity of Christ. In fact, Jesus is so much God, he cannot be man. And the Arians said, no, Jesus is man. In fact, he's so much man that he cannot be God. And the church came along and said, anathema. Jesus is God and man. Not God inside of man, but true God and true man. And it's the integrity of business and of piety that we need to bring together. And that's why I started and said about the incarnation. What I said about the incarnation is what I'm reiterating here.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. So last question to conclude. What do you think, which are your suggestions to move in our conversation from a redistributive rhetoric toward a wealth creation, toward a prosperity rhetoric, and which are, according to you, the practical consequences that such a shift would bring about?
I think, well, first of all, I think we would bring much more intentionality to our workplaces. We're all very concerned about business ethics. Business ethics isn't just abiding by the law. That's what you get from just a utilitarian point of view. When real business ethics have to be based on virtue. So it's the formation of the person who's engaged in the work. Now imagine what happens if people are really infused with that vision of themselves as entrepreneurs who are missionaries, so to speak. And you are every bit as efficient at what you are doing, but we're building cultures that reverence human vulnerability. There'd be ways even of not just giving to the poor, but of incorporating them in your enterprise. There's a businessman in my parish, in addition to my work at the Acton Institute, a think tank, I'm also a parish priest. And there's a man in my parish who runs a rather good-sized business that deals with, let's say it's furniture. It's really kind of the coating on top of furniture, but let's just say it's furniture. And he hires primarily, to a very great extent, people who have had prison records and who find it difficult to find work once they get out of jail. And he knows, and he hires them, and he knows that it's going to cost him a little bit more in his overhead to employ them because they need a little bit more attention. They need to acclimate, to develop habits of being on time and being complete in their work. And he has other people in the shop who themselves have been working there for a while, who also have prison records, who mentor them and tutor them. So that kind of enterprise where you're not just, I guess you could give money to people who've gotten out of prison who can't find a job. You could get them food and things like that. But boy, to build an enterprise that incorporates them slowly into it, and the man is making a profit, doing it. So it's that kind of creativity and moral sensibility that's what I'm talking about.
That's interesting, and I guess, but this will bring us too far away. Also, the importance of the institutional framework. That's very important because I think about Italy. Unfortunately, I have seen entrepreneurs with that spirit. In example, hiring people with disabilities and making a profit. Yeah. But sometimes, you have the government come in and say, you can't do this because you don't comply with this and that regulation. So basically you are frustrating in your attempt to create wealth and doing something good for the less fortunate. And again, we come back to our initial discussion, good intentions, but very bad outcomes.
The phrase that I have used, that some people love the poor so much, they want to make more of them.
Very true. Yes, that's very true. So let's hope that our conversation today would help people not only within the Catholic environment to develop a sort of vision of entrepreneurship as a mission, as you just mentioned, and as part of our Eucharistic life and mystical union with God. So entrepreneurship and work as the possibility of a mystical union with God. That I like it very much, and it appeals to my Carmelite spirituality somehow. So thank you very much, Father. It was a pleasure.
Ti ringrazio molto per l'invito. Grazie.
Grazie a te, e spero che il pubblico gusti questa conversazione e ne faccia veramente tesoro per l'azione nel mondo.
Grazie.
Nel mondo, grazie. Ma non del mondo.
Sì.
Grazie.
Grazie.